Welcome to the third session of the European Day for the Border Guards, the panel discussion on the price of borders. Before starting, I hope you enjoyed your lunch and that you also had an opportunity to visit the exhibition and, of course, to talk to colleagues from other countries. Before I say a few words about the topic of the session, let me first briefly introduce the panelists we have today. You already have seen on the screen what they do, actually. So I will just limit myself to mentioning the names. On the left-hand side next to me is Dr. Frank Paul, European Commission. Raphael Ron, who has his own company in the US and specialist in aviation security. Gavin McCairns from Down Under, Australia, the Department of Immigration and Border Protection, and Sadhbh McCarthy of the Center for Irish and European Security. This makes me wonder, why, by the way, Ireland, isn't that Europe also?
It's special.
Okay, I see. The price of borders. Member states of the EU, but states in general, invest quite a lot of money in equipment, in human resources for providing border security, for providing border control. Now, looking at what the results are of border control, taking into account that well over 95% of the people crossing the border, that they do not have any issue with the border control authorities. In other words, they have nothing to fear, they have nothing to hide, they just cross the border. And if we take into account what we see is an outcome of border control, the amount of people refused at the border, but also the irregular migrants detected, the ones that tried to make their way into a state, into Europe, in between the border crossing points. If you offset that against the total amount of people that crossed the border, then what are we talking about? Isn't this peanuts? In other words, the investment compared to the result, does it pay off? And this is the question I would like to start with, and I would like to give the panelists the possibility to react to that question, and then we take it from there. And therefore, first I would like to invite Frank Paul to elaborate on it and tell us if it pays off what we are doing.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much to Frontex for inviting me. Price of borders. Just to give you a figure, we have invested roughly 2 billion euros over the past decade in large-scale IT systems, upgrade of the SIS2, which also has a police component, but is largely obviously intended for border guards. The visa information system with an important border control component, plus Eurodac, which although not directly linked to border control, obviously is also very important for processes at the borders. And we're going to spend another estimated 1.3 to 1.5 billion euros, billion in the American sense, on the Smart Borders package, which is right now on the table, which will contain an entry-exit system, which is biometrics based, and a registered traveler program for pre-vetted individuals who will then be able to pass the border in an almost totally automated fashion. So, is it really justified to spend that type of money? And my assumption is, and obviously we have thought about this very carefully, otherwise we wouldn't have made the proposal, is that absolutely yes, and there is no choice. And I'll build my case on two indications. First of all, the number of travelers is going to rise dramatically. That has to do with a lot of elements. Last but not least, the fact that very, very large economies, such as India and China, are developing very fast, and for the first time ever, a part of the population will be able to afford international traveling. And like everyone else, and most of us, at least once in their life, they want to see the Eiffel Tower and other things that our beautiful continent has to offer. So we expect that the number of international travelers by 2030 is going to increase 2- to 3-fold. Now there are two options if we do nothing about the way we control people at the borders. Either we increase the number of border guards substantially if we leave our processes as they are, which nobody will be able to afford, especially if you look at the budgetary situation these days. This is not possible, it's unrealistic. Or we decrease the level of security, which is also not an option. So we have to find a way to be able to process the increased number of passengers while at the same time maintaining or even increasing the level of security, and I would add, without making the border crossing experience worse for the individual. On the contrary, because we are an open and welcoming continent and want to remain that, we have to make sure that we're able to speed up the processes and make them smarter, hence the Smart Borders package. So now how are we going to do about this? How are we going to go about this? There is not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think there are basically two concepts and two schools of thought. One school of thought is that, okay, let's try to pre-process, meaning that we try to get information as much as we can prior to the individual arriving at the border. So when he or she arrives at the border, we will already know whether that individual represents a certain risk or not, and then we can apply the processes accordingly. As insinuated by EDGAR, this would mean that for the vast majority of risk-free travelers, as it were, or people we don't attach any particular risk to, they would be able to go through almost uncontrolled, not uncontrolled as such, because we have done a pre-control based on the pre-information, but not controlled at the border. Or the alternative is to say, okay, we cannot afford to not control the individual, but we have to do it in a smarter way. And what we have opted for and what we are advancing is the second option. I'll explain why. The pre-information approach works well in only one specific environment. It could work in two specific environments, and those are the air borders and the sea borders. We'll later hear about Australia. There you have a totally different business case, which is why I said from the outset, this is not a one-size-fits-all answer we can give. In Australia, you only have de facto air borders. So yes, of course, you can get information and it's very useful. You can process it, you have the time to do it, you can even deny boarding, etc. You could do the same with ferry terminals to some extent. You cannot do this at the land border. You cannot introduce an ESTA-type solution, for instance, at the European land borders. That is unrealistic. So therefore, the only approach to us is we have to continue to control everybody on arrival, but we have to do two things. A, we have to speed up the control process, because if you're able to control, to query all your systems where you have the answers that you need on the risk that the person represents, you have to do that very quickly. And we can do it today, and we have the technology. We do it in the SIS2 within split seconds. If you do that, the second thing you have to think about, it's about the sheer number of passengers. How do you make sure that the actual control process is automated where you can do it without making any compromise on the level of security? And this is what we do. So A, speed up the processing times in the background processes and automate as much as possible. And I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Raphael.
I think that what we heard is very promising, and there's a good reason to believe that that this is the right direction to go. Actually, I want to argue that there's no other way. All the other alternatives are the type of alternatives that are doomed to fail by definition, and there's really no need to take them out to the field and actually experience that failure. But I think that what we need is to pay perhaps a lot of attention to the details of how are we going to implement what we like to call a risk-based approach that will allow us to invest our resources with the individuals that may present a risk to us, the criminal, immigration-wise, or security-wise, and in a way that will make it effective. Because if we look at what the situation has been for many years, I think that my colleagues will agree with me that the one-size-fits-all solution that is based on the short interview at the checkpoint position is something that is outdated. This system was developed many decades ago when the number of passengers or travelers was small, and most of the conflicts between nations, and I'm talking now about security, were dealt in the either in the battlefield or in the diplomatic field, but terrorism was not a major part of our life as it is today. And the difference, obviously, is that when we have to address terrorism, the entry point to the country becomes one of the critical points where we need to be able to identify and possibly stop a potential terrorist from entering the country. We failed to do that in the past in many cases, and I'm not talking specifically only about Europe. I think that the near past history has showed us that the terrorists like the 9/11 group and many others were not stopped at the borders, and in that case, despite the fact that there's a visa requirement for all of them, and we practically what we have been doing at the entry point was very much based on the good old the human factor interview that we have been implementing for the last 100 years, probably. Today's world presents not only greater risks with the addition of terrorism and a global organized crime, but the influence of the information revolution on the motivation of people to leave the place where they have lived for many, many years and move to other locations. But I think that on the better side, we have better technology that we can deploy. And I'm talking about information technology. I agree with my colleague that obviously that is relevant mostly to the air and sea entry points, and hardly relevant to ground entry points, where you can hardly know who to expect. But at the same time, I think that there's still a lot that can be done in order to develop the ability to identify potential so-called bad guys before or at the point of arrival, based on the technology that is available to us today. I think we will have the opportunity to talk about that in more details later, and I will be also happy to answer questions about that.
Thank you, Ron. Gavin, I mean, Frank already mentioned the peculiar situation that Australia finds itself in, being an island quite far away from other countries.
It's quite near Papua New Guinea.
Yes, okay. I guess you will elaborate on that a little bit and the kind of approach you are following.
So first of all, not only thanks to Frontex, but thank you for coming after lunch. As you can hear, I'm Scottish and I now live in Australia. There's two factors there you should realise. One, English is my second language. So if you write your name and address on a €20 note and send it in, I'll give you a full interpretation of what I'm saying. And secondly, I migrated to Australia in 1991, which shows you how bad their migration and border policy was back then. In this first session, I want to lay the scene for something we have done just recently. And even although we've got a unique set of circumstances, I think there's things we can learn from each other. Now, most of you will have heard of the 4 V's of big data. And the 4 V's of big data, for those of you who don't know them, are volume, and Frank's mentioned that already. Velocity, it's gone exponential now, it's not an arithmetic curve. Variety, now that could be the data, but it could be smaller ports, smaller airlines, etc. And veracity, how reliable is the data you've actually collected? We've got 4 V's in Australia, and I'm sure most of Europe's the same. No one's given me any more resources, so the resources are getting less. And so the volume curve is going like that, and the resource curve's doing that. But I would add a 5th V, and it came up this morning in the main debate when the word ethics was used, and I would like to use the word values. What the values we might want to place upon these 4 V's. And so, when I started on this journey 3 or 4 years ago, people said it's like looking for a needle in the haystack. And I quite like Einstein's definition of madness, which is if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, you must be mad. And for 10 years, people much smarter than me had been trying to solve this border conundrum that Frank's alluded to. And so one morning in the shower, just a couple of years ago, I thought, it's not getting a magnifying glass to make the needle bigger. Why don't I try and reduce the hay? The needle's the same size, but I've got less hay to search through. And that will be the idea I'll explain to you later. So Australia, you're absolutely right, Frank. It's 2 what you might call unique selling points, USPs. We have no contiguous land border, and we also have a universal visa requirement. That makes us very, very different, but I still think there are bits we could learn here, as it were. And I wanted to just talk about the 12 seconds, Edgar? The 12-second rule? Because we have a universal visa requirement, unless you rock up to check-in with an electronic travel authority permission, which most of Europe has, and board a plane, then there's a bit of time between the grant of a visa and someone traveling. Sometimes it's years, by the way. And therefore, my contention in the Australian context is that unless you're on a watch list, a visa grant is a border crossing. And if you grant that visa, you've got time to do something about that. Because if you apply for a visa, even an ETA, the Electronic Travel Authority, it's a little baby visa, it sits behind your passport when you come to Australia from America or Ireland or England or Germany. But that visa grant equals a border crossing, and I collect data from that visa grant. I also have 10 years worth of data in a data warehouse. And that 10 years worth of data tells me who was granted a visa, who went home when they should have gone home, who didn't go home when they should have gone home, who came here as a tourist but started to work, etc., etc. And my friend here loves my phrase of adverse compliance outcomes. So I know the good and I know the bad, as it were. I looked at the Amazon business model, and the Amazon business model was fascinating. Amazon has the largest data warehouse on the planet. And the Amazon business model says, Frank likes blue suits and white shirts, He's bought 3 or 4 of them over the past couple of years. They send Frank an email and they say, the Italian version's in, it's Egyptian cotton shirts, they're half price if you buy this week, because they've built that pattern from Frank. I often have first-time shoppers. I have people who haven't shopped before, they haven't been to Australia before. But because I've got 10 years worth of data of the good and the bad, I might not know Frank, but I probably know people just like Frank, who are very similar characteristics to Frank, as it were. And so very quickly, and I'll move on, I said to my team a couple of years ago, I'm going to ask you something absolutely ridiculous. I'm going to ask you to put a set of traffic lights on every single incoming passenger's head in real time. So red, dodgy, amber, maybe not so dodgy, green, good to go, as it were. But I have to bring some cultural stereotyping into this. I'm Scottish by birth. I'm very, very mean with the taxpayers' money. Very tight as well. So I said, and you're getting no money to do it. Zero money. And I mean zero money. And I'll tell you later in the second session what to do. The previous attempt to do this took 4 years and cost $10 million and failed miserably. And I'll leave it here by just saying we have visa data, we have APP as we call it, API I think you call it, our customs friends have got PNR. That's quite a rich data set, as it were, plus 10 years worth of data in the data warehouse. So I'll finish off by saying 3 more very, very quick things. In this morning's main debate, we talked about intelligence and surveillance and them being different. I think big data and predictive analytics is the bridge between intelligence and surveillance, as it were. How we did this was we created a laboratory. So when we talked about Frontex as the laboratory, we created a little laboratory within our department where people could experiment and try things, as it were. But the last thing I want to say, especially to my uniformed friends in the audience, the computer cannot spot the sweat on someone's brow. Only a good border officer can spot the sweat on someone's brow. But the computer can help tell us who should be sweating.
Thank you, Gavin. I understand it that, I mean, going back to the main topic of the session, the price of borders, your answer is that I give no money and still want new things to be introduced, the traffic lights, no?
I'll tell you how we did this later.
Okay. Saif, we have heard now from Frank the European approach. We have heard the approach from Australia, and we also have a more independent point of view, as explained to us by Rafi. How do you see that? What's your view on the cost and the benefit? Does it pay off?
Okay, well, I suppose I'd have to start by saying that when we talk about cost benefit or the price of borders, it's not always about the economic cost. It's not always about money. So I'm not really although I'm obviously thinking about the 1.3 billion that Frank wants to spend on a the border solutions that might be needed. There are other things that we would also need to include in our overarching consideration of what is the cost of protecting our borders in this way. So mostly, I think we should think about the social and ethical costs. It's easier for me to specifically relate this to the Smart Borders initiative because the proposals and the options and the Commission legislative proposals are quite clear. And we can see what it is they're trying to do, why they want to do it, and the justification for these initiatives. But we need to also understand not only, okay, what is it trying to do, how much is it going to cost in economic terms, but do we understand the legitimacy and the justification and the impact that any such system might have on fundamental rights, data protection, and the kinds of proportionality and necessity tests that would be required of such a system. One of the problems, I think, that challenges a number of people with regard to Smart Borders is, what is it actually trying to do? I mean, I completely understood the point that was being made by Frank that we're going to have 4 times as many travellers. And obviously, you can't have 4 times as many border control guards. You don't necessarily want to reduce your security. But I'm not entirely sure what the entry-exit system would do to manage that. As far as I can understand, what it's going to do is identify overstayers. And our question really there is saying, all right, so you have all of these people coming. This is the only reason that you wouldn't be able to identify these people through the VIS system anyway is if they were from a country that had a reciprocal relationship and didn't necessarily have to get a visa. And then if they overstayed their 90 days, you'd be able to tell that they'd overstayed. Okay, so now you know that there's a whole lot of people have overstayed. Well, what are you going to do about it? They've come in at a point, they've come into Europe in a border in Italy, and they could be anywhere now. They could be in Norway. Norway is obviously a bad example. They could be in Sweden. They could be anywhere in Europe. So the only way that you could then subsequently do anything about the overstayers is if you actually started to have a process of tracking people down in some way, and then that's a completely different agenda. Furthermore, you're going to be collecting an awful lot of additional data in order for the RTP to work about legitimate innocent travellers. Why should legitimate innocent travellers have data collected about them for no good reason? Illegal immigration is obviously a problem. But the reality is that illegal immigration takes place in illegal situations. People come across our borders, they try to come by boat, they try to come by truck and by lorry and undetected. The percentage of people trying to cross a border with fake documents or overstaying is actually a tiny percentage of the total number of people that are travelling in and out of Europe at the border points. So what's the proportionality of a 1.3 million or billion euro investment and a large collection of data, a retention of data, for what? I mean, what's it going to actually achieve? There's a climate of austerity in Europe. And in a way, you're asking us, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is we're being asked to spend money on a system which replicates a huge amount of an existing system, the VIS system. And at best, it can only contribute to a small percentage of the problems that we have with illegal border crossings or that we could potentially have in the future. The other kind of broader concept, I suppose, is that there's a growing, and because of the economic downturn, there's a growing hostile climate towards immigrants, both legal and illegal. And when we invest this vast amount of money and we sort of disregard some of our fundamental rights obligations to a system which is dedicated to detecting and removing visa overstayers, making it a priority over and above any other type of economic resuscitation, it sort of feeds that dangerous and inflammatory rhetoric that says, you know, half of our problems are being caused by immigrants, whether they're legal or illegal, and that our economic troubles are down to these issues. And that's such a fundamentally un-European way to think. So we really have to, from my point of view, really want us to think carefully about what it is we're asking, you know, what it is we're trying to do. Are we really trying to solve a problem that is a big threat to Europe? Or are we just creating yet another theatrical vision of a threat that we don't have great empirical evidence for it existing, and that the solution we're proposing is more about feeding a populist or a public demand for something to be done than is actually really going to deal with anything? I mean, I'll finish up by saying that the proposal, technocentric proposal, this idea that technology solves everything, is an attractive and it's a seductive narrative. Get more data, build better systems, create smarter algorithms, make it faster, make it bigger. It doesn't take into account the sort of unintended consequences of that. And as a final sort of thought, I'd say, in a European value sense, Gavin referred to values, and I do think it's really important that we keep values in mind. If you're thinking about European values, not only do we want to make sure that we don't foster illegal immigration, right, people coming over our borders, but we really don't want to force more migrants to come in dangerous, unauthorized ways. All that's doing is increasing the number of illegal migrants that are coming in ways which will be costly for them and a human life cost, but it's also a cost for Europe in terms of managing that. So,
thank you, Saif. Before continuing, I just would like to remark that at the end of the next round, there will be a possibility to raise questions to the panelists. So hang on to your questions till the second round. Thank you. Frank, I guess I will give the floor back to you. I just picked up some questions that were raised you might want to react to. I mean, basically it's about what will the Smart Borders package do? Why collect data on people who do not have anything to do with, or do not have any problems, do not cause any problems? And the last thing you mentioned was quite interesting. And do you also see or the possibility that we will see a kind of shift maybe away from the borders, from the border crossing points, I mean, and more towards people trying to cross the border in between the border crossing points or irregular migration as a result of the introduction of Smart Borders package?
Okay, yeah, indeed. Interesting questions. Also, I'm especially grateful for Sadhbh because she gives me now the opportunity to be a mythbuster. Because indeed, I think you have brought to the front some popular misunderstandings or misconceptions. The first one is that societal cost. We are very much attached, obviously, to values as well, and indeed, we heard about the 4 V's, then a 5th V was introduced. I would arguably say this is the most important V of all the 5. Societal cost. What is the societal cost of irregular migration? I'm well placed to talk about this because I'm also the head of the European Commission's task force on irregular migration. Contrary to what Sadhbh said, it is indeed the vast majority of irregular migrants who comes in as overstayers. The number of people, be it 30 to 40,000, I think, in the last season, who come in via the Mediterranean, pale, and obviously it's a tragedy, and we have to do everything that these people continue risking their lives, and we have to save lives wherever we can, that's obvious. But at the same time, in terms of total numbers, the figure that I just mentioned pales against the estimated 800,000 people who come in every year into the Schengen area as overstayers, who simply don't leave when they're supposed to leave. Now, what is that in terms of societal cost, I'm asking you? Because what are these people doing? They are all in an extremely vulnerable situation. There are the people who work on construction sites for €3 an hour. They're the people who work in the sex industry, okay, who are being exploited. And these are huge societal costs. So we have to do everything we can about these overstayers. And mind you, talking about societal costs, the very unpleasant discussion we have about irregular migrants, which is totally blown out of proportion and is water on the mills of the heinous right-wing parties that are emerging, unfortunately, here and there. All this is partly caused by that type of irregular migration phenomenon, okay? So we have to do something about this. And indeed, there is no way other than, A, to use biometrics, because you have to be able to tie an identity to a person. That's one thing. And the other thing is there's no other way than registering the entry and the exit. And the visa information system as such does only a fraction of that job. Firstly, because there's no systematic check at exit. What's the point of knowing whether a person came on a valid visa when we don't know whether he left actually on time? That's one thing. And secondly, another mythbuster, it is not necessarily visa holders who overstay. The vast majority, actually, for the time being, at least the way we see it, are people who come in from visa-waived countries, partially recently visa-waived countries, without wanting to name them, okay? So this is why we need the entry-exit system. And indeed, it's a totally different question of what you want to do with the overstays once you have identified them. But that's another question before you even come to answering this, because you come to that bridge and you can cross it, you have first to know who are these overstayers and how many are they, okay? For instance, for the time being, in practical terms, you have a control, say, at the exit of the French metro system, okay? The underground system. So you check your people, and then out of those who are visibly foreigners or obviously foreigners or probably foreigners, I'm sure you have, and have no identification of them, I'm sure that 80% of them will tell you the same story. I am from country XYZ. Of course, I'm legally here, but unfortunately, just the other day, my passport was stolen or I lost it or whatever, okay? Today, there is absolutely no way you will be able to find out whether that is true or not. In the future, either via the visa information system and generally speaking via the entry-exit system, including for the visa-waived nationals, third country nationals, you will be able to identify them and to know immediately whether this is a true story or not. It'll also help those people who have really lost their identification papers to get them back quickly, because identity can be established very quickly. So there are all types of societal implications, and it shouldn't be only seen in terms of, well, what about all the innocent people? The problem is also, it is not possible to tell by a person's nose or the color of his or her eyes whether he or she is innocent. This is a bad word, but for want of a better one, and it's because of one that you used. You only know that this person gets in, and of course the presumption of innocence is always there, but you will only know at the very end. But in order to come to that end, you have first to have the data at entry. You will only know at the very end whether the person has left on time or not. So whether that person has come with good or bad intentions, you will only know much later. Now, coming back very quickly to the question of how we want to go about this and to make sure that indeed we are spending less money or spending money in a better way. It is true that this Smart Borders package will lead initially to huge investments, but on the other hand, it will avoid hiring more border guards, which is unrealistic, and therefore it will avoid a natural drop in the level of security that we apply. On the contrary, we believe that we will have a much higher level of security, because as we are about to automate most processes, we will be able to reallocate the scarce resources that we have to deal with the more risk cases. So that will, as such, already increase the level of security. And then another thing is, with the technology that we have, we're in particular for the time being looking at accelerators. And that means that without compromising on security, we will, for instance, ask the individual to self-enroll certain information, to self-enroll the biometrics. When he or she arrives, typical airport situation, people hang around the baggage gathering area doing nothing, watching their smartphones, etc. And why not use that time that people go up to self-enrollment kiosks, provide the information that they need to provide at the border, and then speed up the subsequent processes so that everybody can go through as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Rafi, we have heard Frank talking about the initial huge investment, Smart Borders package, the reallocation of staff, that is the possibility, and then the reallocation of staff to more risk cases. How would you put that into operation? How would you see that this would work out in practice, by how to organize that?
Yeah, well, I think that once we decided to replace the old system with a risk-based system, it requires a much deeper look into how are we going to assess that risk, and what type of information we're going to use in that risk assessment, and where are we going to get this information. I have to say, first of all, that I am not an expert on immigration. My area is security. And in security, intelligence plays a key role. And the rule, the most basic and simple, maybe, definition of intelligence is that you collect relevant information to create or to identify what we call dots, and then you try to connect the dots with a line and make an assumption about where the next dot is going to appear, and whether that next dot is relevant to you to intervene or not. This is a very tricky area. It's a minefield as far as the civil rights and other issues are concerned. And unlike the situation in the past where intelligence was mostly used for pure defense issues, they're mostly in the military domain, that kind of kept us away from the civil rights issues and other values that that we're trying to protect on the civilian side. Here in this case, this is different. And it brings up a lot of questions that have to be discussed thoroughly, and decisions have to be taken with risk that is, when we say that we are taking a risk-based approach, the risk is also in areas that we are not used to take risk, like political the domain. And when we talk about, again, about the risk-based approach, there are two basic phases that we should be looking at. The first one is using information that is already available to us. There's information in various databases. Whether we are allowed to use that information or not, that's a matter of decision. And if we decide to use that information is available to us. And I'll give you a simple example that becomes very complicated as far as decision-making is concerned. And that is when it comes to the private sector, and especially the financial industry, we are already doing this for years. If you look at the credit evaluation companies that make a living out of following the way every one of us is using his or her credit cards, and actually run a profile on that person to be able to make a risk assessment when you apply for a mortgage or when you are going to buy a new car, and that dictates the level of interest that you are going to pay, or may be even be completely rejected from getting the loan that you're seeking. But when it comes to the state level or to the society level, obviously many other issues come to play, and those risks that can be taken by private banks cannot be taken by governments in the same manner. But there has to be a way in between. This is not a digital situation with either 0 or 1. This is a spectrum, and we need to be able to identify where we want to place ourselves on this spectrum in order to be able to protect ourselves against the risk. And here, again, since I already mentioned the fact that I am not talking out of the expertise in the immigration domain, in the security domain, this can be critical. Because if you look at, for example, at the way a single event like 9/11 has changed the lives of all of us in such a dramatic way, and we want to avoid these type of situations in the future, including, by the way, the overreaction after 9/11 in certain countries, which I will not name, where this has been taken to an extreme that actually jeopardizes civil rights to an unacceptable level. Not to mention all kind of ridiculous rituals that we have to take at the airport today, like taking off shoes and other things that they simply doesn't make sense to the sensible person. I just want to leave us with this as a question mark, as a question rather than a complete answer, because I think that we need to investigate this issue to a much deeper level, that something we have avoided for many years, and only in the last few years we started to relate to this in a deeper way.
Thank you, Rafi. Moving on to Gavin. We heard Raphael talk about the risk assessment. You also mentioned it. You mentioned that, the computer cannot indicate who is sweating, but might be able to indicate who's supposed to be sweating. So how does it work out in the Australian practice? I mean, how do you make this match between the technology on the one hand and the human, the border guard?
Sure, absolutely. I'm what we call a public servant in Australia, civil servant it would be often in the UK. And so this is as political as I'm going to get for the whole day, is that all migration, irregular or regular, is a combination of the economy and public opinion. And so I just think it's important to remember that. So if the economy is going extraordinarily well, the public have a more tolerant attitude to both regular and irregular migration. If the economy starts to go backwards further and further, then a different a different public opinion dynamic develops, and governments pay attention to that. It's interesting you talked about banking. The first person I talked to, because we had no clue how to do this, Raphael, was the head of security for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, because they had been in this business for a long time. So remember the problem? We're looking to put a set of traffic lights in everyone's head. Scottish stereotyping, no money. And we set people, so we had some analysts there, some statisticians, people who knew the border, people who knew visas. We put them together in what we called the laboratory. It was just desks, and we just called it the laboratory. It wasn't an actual laboratory. And we said, go and have a play. This is a sandbox or a sandpit. Go and have a play. I was paying the wages, I was paying for the lighting, I was paying for plugging in the computer. No one was pushing me for an answer in 5 minutes, and I said, go and have a play. In 6 weeks, the team had come up with a risk scoring system that talked to our 10-year-old database via an open source piece of software called R, the letter R. Open source software, so it was free. That was a little pilot, and they actually got it working with live data, just on a computer in an office. Within 6 months, they had built a prototype of a border risk identification system. That cost $50,000. That's not even petty cash for IT people. You know, that's drinks on a Friday afternoon for the IT people in our place. And that was to pay a consultant who knew how to drive R, this open source software. Within 1 year working, starting with Sydney Airport, and I used to manage the staff there, and they're the most cynical border inspectors in Australia, so I knew if I could convince them, I could convince anyone. And within 6 months, they had calibrated it, redesigned it, reconfigured it, changed, the fields, and I'll tell you about that in 1 second. And within 1 year, we had an actual border risk identification system in every airport working in Australia, and I'll tell you the performance of it in a second, for $1 million. The previous system, and everyone uses it, in the previous system they spent 4 years and spent $10 million and it didn't work and no one used it. Very quickly, because we're running out of time, what it does using that visa data, APP data, API, I think you call it here, 2 minutes after check-in, any port on the planet, 24/7, I have the data in, scored, and back out again against a range of risk indicators. I won't go through the detail of that because we don't have time, but let's put it this way, it's what you were saying about overstayers and things like that. So, there's a range of what I might call migration indicators scored against, and that is 0 to 1, so it's 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, but I've got a third column, which is binary, it's 1 or 0, because I asked them, I'm very impatient and I never have enough. You can tell by my waistline. So I asked them to solve the Donald Rumsfeld problem as well, the unknown unknowns. And so what the unknown unknowns column is, it's 1 or 0. It's either irregular or not regular, or known or unknown. And I'll give you a concrete example of it. Single person, male, traveling one way to Kingsford Smith Airport in Sydney on a Japanese passport from Fiji. That doesn't happen. Now, we're not saying that person's irregular or shouldn't be in Australia. We're just saying that's an anomalous travel pattern. That person's in no watch list. That person's in no database. and indeed it turned out to be someone who meant harm to Australia, and I won't bother going into the details to it. So we've built this 1 or 0 column on anomalous travel patterns, as it were. And lastly, just before I talk about the return on investment, it's got a self-regulating device to it, and so if the actual predictions don't match the actuality at the border, it starts to close itself down, so we don't persist with something that isn't working because the global environment changes all the time. So it's got a regulatory device built in, and very, very quickly, the return on investment, I'll give you this for 4 months pre-BRIS, the Border Risk Identification System, and 4 months after BRIS. This is July to October 2010, pre-BRIS, July to October 2013, once BRIS was in and working. The travel volumes had gone up 12%. Staffing at the border had gone down. The referrals, the actual people tapping someone on the shoulder in the airport to say, could you step aside, they were the same and had decreased slightly. What we call refused immigration clearance, the people we said should not be in Australia because they came for a purpose other than their visa allowed. The number of refused immigration clearances in that 6 months had increased by 42%. So for a system that cost $1 million with the same number of staff, we are bugging less people at the border, and the refused immigration clearances increased by 42%. That's my return on investment point, Edgar.
Thank you very much. Sadhbh, having listened to Gavin, this seems to be a success story. What do you think?
I think this is... Yeah. I mean, I think this is actually, in a way, what I'm trying to say. And, you know, I'm sorry, Frank, I'm not accepting that you busted any myths. Yes, overstayers are a huge problem, but you haven't at all answered the question of what you're going to do about them. So you're not in, you know, all you'll do is identify. So it's just more evidence. You're building up the number. We don't even know the exact number. So that's what it is. Viz can be augmented to handle the visa. I mean, it might be difficult, but can't see how it costs much more than 1.3 billion to handle the visa waiver countries, which I didn't know about. I think what's really interesting is to hear the Australian model, where you're dealing with, and it is different. Okay, there is this consistency. I mean, you have a contiguous border, and everybody has to have a visa, and that makes it a much easier system. I mean, one of the problems for Europe, of course, is it's so complex. And there's so many different ways that people can come and go, and how they come and go, and their status and so on. So I do accept that that's an issue, but you don't have to take my word for it. By the way, for those of you saying, "Who's your woman? What's she talking about?" The Article 29 Working Group issued a paper in response to the Commission legislative proposals on EES, and basically said that their opinion was that they did not think that the proposal meets the threshold for necessity and proportionality, that it's just not, that the value the system may bring does not justify the creation of large-scale databases, which will involve the collection of biometrics, and they have some problems with the data retention and so on. When we hear about what the Australians are doing, that sounds like a much more sensible way to go about things, because you're actually managing risk rather than controlling populations. Whereas what we seem to be doing is saying, let's try and control everything. If we monitor everybody, if we capture everybody, if we check everything. Frank, you can correct me on this because I could be completely wrong. This is something you're much more familiar with. But I think we started talking about entry-exit system around 2004, around the time that the US introduced US Visit. US Visit has been developed, implemented, and sunset because of problems that, particularly with the exit component of it. And yet we're still sticking with the original concept as it was envisaged by US Visit. And I guess that's maybe where I have a problem now. Things can take a long time to move in large, complex bureaucracies like the European Union and the European Commission. So, we could all have an ambition to do something, but I can imagine in my heart that if, somebody said, you know what, let's scrap EES and let's go by the Australian thing, that there's no way you could do that without a huge amount of process and legislation and discussion. So, I mean, life is not that simple. Nevertheless, I think we should constantly evaluate the cost and the benefit of what we consider a border and how we consider managing those borders.
Thank you, Sadhbh. I believe we have a really nice discussion going, but we also have a look at the clock, and time is going on, and as I promised, I would also give the opportunity to the audience to raise questions to the panelists. So basically, it's up to you now. Yes, question over there. Maybe a microphone can be moved that way. Maybe please state your name and also to whom you are directing the question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Kostas Karagatsous. I am a Commodore of the Hellenic Coast Guard. I have a question actually for Mr. Paul, but if any other panelists want to speak, please go ahead. A few years ago, I was dealing with drugs, and in the last years, I was dealing with migration and borders. So dealing with drugs, I have noticed that the legal framework was there. The member states have done a marvelous job. They have even set up joint investigation teams. Europol, for example, has created a handbook for drug informants. So I want to say that a marvelous job was done on drugs several years ago. On the other hand, speaking about migration and borders, we are listening about all these marvelous changes with the smart borders package, with the large IT systems, the entry-exit system. So my question is, why did it take the Union so long to progress at migration and borders topics? Why the Union has progressed to drugs so much, so many years ago, and it had to be those days to speak about all these changes? Was it a matter of huge amount of money needed? Was it a matter of lack of know-how or expertise? What was the real reason that the Union delayed, let's say, on migration and borders issue? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think the answer could be a very short one, but I'll still elaborate a bit though. If I wanted to give you a very short answer, I have to say that a union moves only as fast or slowly as its members wanted to move. It's not that the European Commission or the European institutions work in an isolated fashion. It's the member states who make up the European Union. It's all of us who make up the European Union who determine the pace. That's one thing. The second part of the answer, and that's probably a bit longer, is that it is the debate on migration always has a totally different societal and political dimension than drugs. I would say that apart from the soft recreational drugs, 99% of the population would agree that drugs are a bad thing. Okay? When it comes to migration, we have people like Sadhbh, we have other people, we have the right-wingers, we have the left-wingers, and they all have different views on how to deal with irregular migration. And people who are less concerned because they are not having large and difficult to control external borders like Greece, for instance, but take, for instance, Luxembourg, okay? If you ask people in Luxembourg how they feel about irregular migration, I'm sure they give you probably a different storyline that people who live close to the Turkish-Greek border, okay? That's, I think, in a nutshell, the answer. This being said, it's also much more difficult to control, and it's also much more sensitive because it's about people. And one of the issues is also that we have probably not, because of that lacking consent on migration issues, and the proof for that, by the way, is that until today, there is no comprehensive European policy on regular migration. Do we have a legal migration system like Australia or Canada with point systems and whatnot? No, because depending on whether you ask a politician from the United Kingdom or a politician from Sweden, you might get a totally different answer on whether this would be a good idea or not. Okay, but another thing is that indeed our legal framework hasn't also kept up with the developments. If today you're being caught at the Greek-Turkish border with a kilo of heroin, you're looking at 10 years in the slammer. Okay, so a huge, huge risk. If you're being caught as a truck driver with 10 irregular migrants in the back of your truck, probably giving you the same type of margin in terms of revenue than you would get with this kilo of H, you are looking at what? maybe not even 1 year of prison, you know, probably being sent back. There's also a mismatch here. So, and criminals, like everybody, love to do things that bring huge revenue with limited risks. Thank you.
Say if you wanted to react to.
Well, I mean, I wanted to say two things. First of all, just to be clear, I don't have an issue, obviously, with border control. I respect the fact that we need, it's really about how we approach it. And I suppose I'm not entirely bought into the technocentric approach. Having said that, I completely agree with Frank in why these things take so long. There is no homogeneous approach across the state, across Europe. And there is always this sense from the member states that the European Commission is made up of, I don't know, you know, they come from the planet. All the people who work in the European Commission are people who come from the Planet Europe Commission. They're not people from Ireland or people from the UK or people from the Netherlands who represent, you know, who go to the Commission as though it's some sort of isolated body, whereas, of course, most of the time the issue is around the member states. And it's completely different and completely understandable that if you live in Italy or if you're in southern Italy, your exposure to illegal immigration and to the challenges of that, whether it's because of the boats coming in or just because people in Italy, is entirely different to Ireland. Completely isolated. We have a very small problem. So it's, you know, I think that's a really big issue. The second thing on that is what Gavin referred to, is immigration is completely political. The immigration, irregular migration, is politicized always in times of economics. So when it suits people to, you know, to use legal or illegal immigration as a form of, you know, populist pandering, let's say, and I think probably everybody's experiencing this at the moment in the European elections, it becomes very difficult for policymakers in the Commission or wherever to actually implement sort of long thought out 3-year policy plans to address a sort of an ongoing problem. That's actually what is going on as opposed to what's presented, the theatre that's going on. So just can everybody remember the bit where I said I completely agree with Frank?
I just wanted to highlight that we have achieved something today during the panel. Yes, is there? I will have one more person ask a question. Yes, here in the front.
Hello, I'm Alan Nelvin, and I'm a freelance journalist. Mr. Ron, you mentioned September 11 attacks in New York twice. Are you suggesting that because all 19 hijackers had valid visas in their passports and had entered the United States legally, are you suggesting that there is some sort of technological way that could have been prevented?
Well, I'm not making any suggestions that go beyond what the U.S. government commission findings are. And in these findings, there is criticism over the fact that some information, at least about 2 of the 19, was available to the United States, at least at the level of turning them into persons of interest. At the time of entering the United States, and that has not occurred. And they were equipped with visas, despite the fact that at that time the information was already available to the United States intelligence community. So, and actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think that at least 1, if not 2, of the 19 terrorists have renewed their visas to the United States shortly before 9/11, there was there was nothing that interfered in their process of entering the United States.
Taking into account the time, I have to wrap it up, this discussion session. Going back to the main topic, the price of borders, I think that if I capture it well, I mean, there is a broad agreement that there is a need to have border control. There is also recognition that the price has to be paid for that. What I sense, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's what we are discussing about is the different way as how we implement it, and more in particular, what we're looking for, and we see different solutions. It's not so much about the regular traveler, but it's more about how are we going to filter out those people who are more of interest than others. And I see there's a different approach as presented by the panelists, if I put it in very broad terms. Having said that, I would just, to round it up, is to thank the panelists for participating, Frank, Ron, Gavin, and Saif. I would like to remind the audience of the fact that we still have ongoing movie sessions till 5:05. And I also would like to invite you to have a look around at the exhibition. And last but not least, I would like to thank you for being here during this discussion session, and I hope that you enjoyed it and found it useful as I did. Thank you very much.